Hi, everyone. My name is Casey Wofford. I'm the confidential advocate with our Relationship Violence and Sexual Assault Prevention Program, and my pronouns are she, her. My phone says that it's 3 o'clock, so I'm going to get started right on the dot with our How to Be a Decent Human Being series. If you have been following our series, you've seen that we've presented on quite a few different topics that have ranged in a variety from understanding what defund the police means to anti-racist basics, how to feel your freaking feels, and breaking the bro code. Those are different presentations that we've provided already. And today I'm going to be focused specifically on the trans population. And this is so important when we talk about ending sexual violence because trans individuals experience some of the highest rates of violence, specifically trans women of color experience the highest rates of violence, and that's not only a local problem, but it's also a worldwide problem that we have. And so when we talk about ending sexual violence, we really have to be looking at ending all forms of violence. And so today we are going to be really examining that intersectionality piece of why the trans population does experience these higher rates of violence. This presentation is meant to be introductory, so it's definitely a 101 presentation. I have received a lot of different education on the trans population and even hours and hours. Still, there's always so much to learn and language is changing, at different times. And so please know that this is introductory. And so if you are more interested in learning more after this presentation, definitely I encourage you to continue to do your own research and know that I will be providing resources at the end. And so a little bit about me. I am a white cisgender heterosexual woman. And then we'll get more into what being cisgender means and defining that a little bit later. But for me, it's always important and I feel comfortable when I present saying this is the lens that I'm speaking from. I actually took a trans affirming therapy class in my master's program for counseling. And it was my professor for that class. His name was Dr. Colt. It was him who, when he started presenting to us, he shared with us his identities. And it was him who really inspired me in a lot of ways that it's okay to say, like, this is the lens that I'm speaking from when presenting. I think it does a really great job of just acknowledging, I have my own lived experiences. I'm not a trans individual providing this presentation. So there are times that I'm like, am I the right person to be speaking about this? But it's really important for me as an ally to the trans community to really raise awareness about the intersectionality with the trans population and the high rates of violence. And so I acknowledge that I have quite a bit of education speaking to the trans population, learning about the trans population, but I have limits. I have blind spots that I'm sure of. And that's for me why I embrace this term here, being a bad advocate. It really just means that I am always in the process of unlearning things that I learned when I was growing up that I wasn't even aware of. I'm always in the process of understanding how our culture perpetuates violence towards marginalized populations. And I'm always in the process of seeing how I'm a part of it or have been a part of that and just continuing to be moved forward, learning new scripts and being a better ally. And so wherever you are with your journey too of becoming an ally, or if you're already an ally, if you're someone who knows nothing about this particular population, just know that wherever you are in your journey, that's completely fine. And know that I'm here to support you. Our VSP is here to support you. And we have an amazing LGBTQ plus program that is here to support you as well. So just know that there's tons of resources for you. So for our objectives today, obviously I'm going to talk about our VSP services. It's really important that y'all know what we do. And then we're going to move from there to understand the intersection of trans discrimination and sexual violence. Then I'm going to present some more statistics about trans discrimination. All of these statistics that I'm going to be talking about today really will help create awareness about what risk factors trans people experience that increase their chances of experience violence. And then from there, we're going to move into definitions. I think it's really important, obviously, if you are trying to be an ally to the trans community, to have a foundation of different definitions. Also acknowledging that with these definitions, it takes time to learn them. Sometimes language changes over time. I mean, just all language changes over time. I think like even this year, Karen was like looked up in our dictionary by different people. I just remember hearing that statistic somewhere. So like language always evolves over time. So please know that the definitions that we talk about today, they don't apply to, 10 years from now. So you have to continue to do your own education as well and just keep up with language as it continues to evolve. And know that definitions, some people identify with, others people don't like. It can, again, just depend on that individual and their history of experience with a certain word or language. So just know when you are speaking to people, it's really important to understand what definitions they would prefer to use as well. And then we're going to move into understanding trans-specific power and control tactics in relationships. And finally, we're going to end on a message of hope and how you can really learn micro-inclusions and how you can be more trans-inclusive and a better ally. And so in terms of RVSP, I want to start out by just making sure y'all are aware of our services. So with RVSP, we provide education, support, and advocacy. Education, obviously it looks like this. That's why part of the reason why we do this How to Be a Decent Human Being series. If there's ever any topics that you are interested in knowing more about, please absolutely let us know. We're here for that. We do a lot of education about consent, alcohol and consent, just nonviolent relationships in general. So again, if there's ever anything that you want to see, let us know. Support. So in terms of support, again, I'm a confidential advocate, which I take a lot of pride in being confidential and being able to hold that space for students if they need somebody to speak to about things that they're going through but aren't sure if they want to report that to the university or if they want to make a criminal report or if they just need someone there to listen, there to not judge them, there to just be a sounding board and say like, hey, this is what I'm going through. What do you think? Or this is what I'm going through. What are my options? So I'm really there as a support piece to make sure that when someone reaches out to us that they feel believed, they know that they are believed, they know all of their options so that they can determine their best path to healing. And then with advocacy and support go hand in hand in a lot of ways. So when we think about RVSP, it's not enough just to support somebody, like support a survivor or victim, however they choose to identify. It's not enough for me just to support someone when they're in my office or in front of me. When we think about really supporting and ending sexual violence, it's so important that we are also advocating for policies that support survivors, advocating to end all forms of violence. And so advocacy looks a lot like this in a lot of ways. It's education. It's really moving towards a nonviolent culture. And the way that we can do that is really understanding all forms of oppression and how violence is perpetuated within our culture. And so I'm going to go ahead and kind of move into, why does RVSP cover the trans population in general? Like, why are we doing this presentation today? And we're doing it again because of the extremely high rates that the trans population experiences in regards to violence, sexual and relationship violence in particularly. And the reason that we see these high rates of violence within the trans community that are perpetuated by people who are homophobic, people who are transphobic, is because we have these forms of oppression that are intersecting. And the more that someone is part of a marginalized population, or the more that someone has different identities that are othered, by the majority population, the more at risk they are to experience violence. So when speaking about violence against the trans community, a lot of times that goes back into thinking about heterosexism. So the fact that the relationships that are considered the norm are often cis heterosexual relationships. So relationships between a person who very much presents as a masculine man and someone who presents as a feminine woman. That's often what we see portrayed in the media and normalized. Sexism in general. So the fact that we have such rigid ideas of gender definitely contributes to violence towards this community. So when we think about rigid gender roles, it's easy to think of so many different examples of how we see gender being pushed on people at such a young age. So you start getting messages about what is considered the norm for your gender before you're even born, right? There's so many different gender reveals. I know my sister has gotten like annoyed with me in the past because I'll be like, that's not a gender reveal. That's a biological sex assigned to you at birth reveal. So it's such a social construct. But even before someone is born, so there's cake being cut somewhere that it's either blue or it's pink. And then walls are painted for that person's room based on what the color showed up as in the cake. And I know that this doesn't happen everywhere, of course, but gender reveals are huge within our society. And so it's just important to realize like messages are getting sent to people about how their gender should act before they're even born. And even then, obviously, it still continues as somebody is growing up. You go through the drive-through line at McDonald's, you get a Happy Meal. People ask, do you want a toy for a girl or a boy? And so these rigid gender norms definitely contribute towards a culture of violence, because when somebody falls outside of those norms or is breaking gender boxes, identifies as non-binary, they are often more likely to experience violence because it's not what's quote unquote considered the norm. And then racism plays a big part in this as well. So trans women of color experience the highest rates of violence. And when talking about racism and how that shows up, you have to, again, think about those overlapping identities. So being a Black man versus a Black woman, how that presents to society, people are going to experience different things. Like people are going to experience different life outcomes, different life events, depending on what gender they're presenting as. And all of these things intersect together and kind of create this perfect storm of the trans population experiencing such high rates of violence. So you can't separate these things out. You can't, again, like you can't talk about ending sexual violence, but you are tolerable of racial violence. You can't talk about ending homophobia, but then tolerate another form of violence. Like you have to be working on all these things at the same time. And that's, again, why we do this series, to really start talking about the intersectionality piece. And I thought these are pretty staggering statistics. So specifically related to sexual violence, 54% of transgender people report having experienced some form of intimate partner violence. 47% of transgender people have been sexually assaulted. And approximately 1 in 6 of the known cases of anti-transgender fatal violence between 2013 and 2018 are suspected to have been committed by an intimate partner. So it's really, really important to understand that trans people absolutely experience intimate partner violence. Intimate partner violence can happen between all genders. It does not matter what someone's gender identity is, but there's more ways that the tactics of power and control can come up. Thinking about a relationship between a trans individual and another trans individual, or a trans individual and a cisgender individual. There's just so many ways that power and control can come up in those relationships that it's important to acknowledge. And we will talk about that a little bit later. And just to let y'all know, these statistics are from the Human Rights Campaign, and I will be providing all the resources at the end as well. So some other statistics that are important to be aware of is that 40% of the homeless youth are LGBTQ+. And so I think when we are talking about the trans community experiencing violence, it's important to be aware of the fact that violence is starting at such a young age. So when someone is transgender or they're gender expansive, so maybe they're just not conforming to what are those gender norms, right? So you go through the drive-through, someone asks, do you want a boy's toy or a girl's toy? And your little girl says, I want a boy's toy. You know, it's not unheard of that the parent will say, no, like you're a girl, you're getting a girl's toy. And what kind of messages is that sending at such a young age, right? It's saying you cannot be your authentic self, you have to operate within the norm. And so a lot of the places that trans individuals first experience violence is within their homes. Is their family being a hostile environment? Is their family not being accepting? And so a lot of times the LGBTQ plus population is either kicked out of their home or the environment is so hostile that it's just not safe for someone to be there. And so they leave their homes and will be homeless to not experience the family violence that they have been having to endure at home. Another statistic that ties right into that is nearly 3 in 4 transgender and gender expansive youth hear their family make negative remarks about the LGBTQ plus community. So if it's not safe to be your authentic self within your home, then that is very damaging to someone's mental health. That can lead to an increase in suicidal thoughts. That can lead to an increase in depression, anxiety, because if your home is not safe for you to operate in your most authentic way, then where is, right? What messages are you getting about how society will treat you as well? And it's not uncommon for someone to not feel safe coming out within their home because they have heard their parents say anti-transgender or anti-LGBTQ plus things, and parents might not be aware of it. They might be watching a show and make a comment. They might see a gay couple on TV and say, I don't want to see that. And those kind of comments can be so damaging, but it absolutely does happen, and it can be devastating for trans youth. And so again, that ties right into the fact that there's 40% of homeless people that are LGBTQ plus youth. And then I thought another very interesting statistic was 13% of transgender people report that one or more professionals, such as counselor, religious advisor, psychologist, tried to stop someone or was a barrier for them to express that they are transgender. So with the transgender population, especially if someone is deciding to do like any kind of medical transitioning, if they are able to do that, what medical care providers will require depending on the extent of surgery. If someone decides to do that, not everybody does, of course, or is able to. But when somebody decides to do that, often they are required to see a counselor, to get the counselor to put in writing, I think this person is of sound mind. I think that this person, absolutely knows that their gender identity does not match with their biological sex assigned at birth. And so they have to get a letter of support for certain surgeries. And that can be such a barrier for people to be able to access surgeries that are going to make them feel more aligned and more confident with themselves. And it just, seeing that statistic really broke my heart in a lot of ways, to see that the people that are supposed to be there to provide help, to provide support, are barriers for this community in a lot of ways. And not everybody, but some, right? And I know when I took my trans affirming class in college for my master's program, I had the privilege of being able to speak to just a handful of different trans individuals about their experiences. And I remember one trans individual I spoke to specifically had told me within Texas, they had tried to seek out counselors a couple times who would write them a letter of support. They had tried to go seek medical care in consultation, and they just kept running into barriers. Even when they filled out the paperwork at the doctors, they would put their name, they would put their pronouns that they wanted to be identified with, and the doctor or the nurse who called them back would still say their dead name. They would still not acknowledge the pronouns that they wrote down. And so every time they were going to get medical care, they were being completely invalidated, which is a form of a microaggression, which is a form of violence. And every single time it just hurt more and more. And so they stopped getting any medical care in Texas. Instead, they were able to fly to a different state where they found a trans affirming counselor, where they found a trans affirming medical provider, and they were able to get the services that they desired. That being said, they even acknowledge like what a privilege that is to be able to do that. Not everybody has the financial means to be able to do that. And so even if someone does like, you know, I'm aware of different trans affirming providers and in Texas as well now, but if someone's unable to find those within their own community, that can cause a lot of barriers, again, to just being able to embrace who you are authentically. And then I thought it was really interesting. So obviously when I was putting this presentation together, I found a lot of different information statistics, and there's a lot of information out there. Even though the research into the trans population is not very comprehensive, it's still relatively new. But I basically pulled statistics that I found were interesting. One was that calls to the Trans Lifeline's trans suicide hotline quadrupled ×4 in the week that was following the Trump-Pence administration's attempt to erase transgender people. So we have seen this last administration, this current administration, do a lot of things to try to roll back trans rights. And so it's also really important to be keeping up with local elections, national elections, and obviously promote people who are going to be in leadership positions who acknowledge the trans population. I mean, that's a huge part of it. Just acknowledge the trans population, the non-binary population exists, and make sure that they have access to equal rights and equal protections. I know that there have been, even during this past election, I remember it was like the first openly trans woman had gotten elected into a Senate position. I forget what state it was. But so we are seeing some of that happening, but we just have to continue to promote that. And we have to understand when someone is elected into a leadership position who does not validate trans individuals, does not want to actively work towards ending transphobia, then we also should be recognizing that the trans people within our communities, the trans people within the United States, even globally, you know, depending on international elections, we have to acknowledge that that has a huge impact on trans individuals' mental health, because at a leadership level, at a policy level, it's saying whether your experiences are valid or not. And then in 2018, 21 anti-transgender bills were introduced by 10 different states. So again, just highlighting the importance of being involved in politics, the importance of not saying that you're non-political. It's really important to really look into your elected officials and be involved in getting people into higher leadership positions who are going to care. And then only 4 in 10 Americans say that they personally know someone who is transgender. And so I think that speaks to the fact that there are people who are trans who are absolutely living in, like if I meet somebody, I'm not going to ask someone typically, are you a cisgender individual or a transgender individual? Like that conversation does not inherently come up just by meeting somebody, right? And so it's really important to know that even if you don't think that you know a trans individual, you very, very well could. Everyone, in terms of being transgender, it's definitely an umbrella term. It encompasses a lot of different things. And so just really important to know, if you think, oh, well, I don't know anyone who's transgender, so this doesn't affect me. It absolutely does. It impacts your community. And so just know that you probably do. You might not just be aware. And so just be aware that trans individuals are definitely involved in our communities. They're all around us, whether you know or not, up in the air. But either way, you should be advocating for their rights. And at least 3 of 4 of the known victims of anti-transgender violence in 2017 to 2018 were misgendered in initial police reports or media reports surrounding their deaths. And that's just another form of violence. And it's terrible to think that that's happening after maybe somebody has been murdered, been violently killed, but then they are misgendered. That's a huge form of a microaggression, to be misgendered or to purposely misgender somebody. If someone tells you, this is my name, these are my pronouns, if you use their dead name, so like the name that's on their birth certificate that they don't go by, if you use the biological sex assigned to them at birth that they don't go by as their pronouns. So like if I tell you today in my presentation, my pronouns are she, her, and then you say he, him, that is a form of violence. And when we think of these forms of violence, I know I have heard people say, well, it's not that big of a deal, or they write something off because it's a microaggression. And the way that it was best described to me in terms of microaggressions, like it's so important to understand that microaggressions are like small forms of violence that occur daily, all the time. It's harassment, it's misgendering people, it is not using someone's pronouns, it is not acknowledging a population exists, saying, oh no, you're either a man or a woman and that's it. It comes up all the time. It's no media representation of trans people or someone not being exposed to it. I know that there obviously is representation, but it's still small, so that's important. But when someone is experiencing microaggressions daily, just over and over and over again, you know, at first it hurts, it stings a little bit, but it's tolerable, right? But then the more and more it happens, it just gets worse and worse. So the way that it was described to me is like, if someone is poking you, that hurts, right? It's annoying, it's painful, but more than anything, it's just annoying. But if someone continues to poke you in the same spot over and over again, harder and harder, and then that spot bruises, and so then you get poked in a different spot, and then that spot bruises, then it just continues to culminate in that person experiencing so much violence that it does have significant mental health impacts that are negative. Depression, anxiety, suicidal thoughts. And so it's just really important to be aware of these small things. Microaggressions are really huge things, and it's so important that we are working towards being inclusive of the trans population, making sure that we are not perpetuating these microaggressions, making sure that we are not the barrier to someone seeking supportive services, that we are voting for people who are acknowledging this population and supporting them and working towards equal rights and equal protections. So all of these things are just so important. It's important to create home environments where someone can feel safe coming out, someone can feel safe expressing their gender whatever way they would like to. And so it starts a lot with really supporting our youth so that they don't experience that family hostility. And another statistic I just think is important when we think about the trans population, there's such a high rate of suicide rates. It is tragic. So for the general non-trans population, the suicide rate is around 4.6%, but then for trans people, it's about 41%. And for trans people who experience sexual assault, that suicide rate, the suicide attempt rate, I'm so sorry, I should have said suicide attempt rate increases to 64%. And so that is an extremely high percentage. And so we have to be working towards really supporting this population, because that's not acceptable. So now that we've kind of talked about statistics, I think it's important to really move into definitions. Even when I first started to learn more about the trans population, I think we spent about 3 hours going over different definitions. And I remember being really overwhelmed initially and like, I'm never going to learn this. And it's all very digestible. For a lot of people, you don't grow up a lot of times exposed to all these different definitions, or maybe even thinking about gender or thinking about biological sex. And so it's really important that as you are able to, you do the research on your own to understand more so that you can see how maybe transphobia has been internalized into you that you're completely unaware of, and start to really unlearn those things. So this trans glossary, I pulled some definitions from this website here at the bottom that's focused on gender minorities. And the definitions are created by the gender minorities. And so I thought it was really important to also reflect those voices versus people who aren't involved in the community. These are only some of the definitions on that website. So if you're interested in exploring more, getting more definitions, by all means. But with the kind of just in the interest of time, I pulled ones that I thought were really important to go over today. And so that first one being gender or gender identity. So I've used the term transgender, I've used this term cisgender already, so now we're going to kind of break down what all of this means. So with gender, it's one's actual internal sense of being male or female, neither of those, or both. So gender is how someone psychologically views themselves. So for me, I psychologically view myself as a woman, and that matches the biological sex that I was assigned at birth. And so therefore that makes me a cisgender individual. If your birth certificate aligns with how you psychologically view yourself, how you internally view yourself, then you would be identifying as a cis or cisgender individual. A transgender individual, when you think of the prefix trans, trans is a Latin root, which means across. So a transgender individual is someone whose like birth certificate, the biological sex assigned to them at birth, does not match their internal view of themselves, that does not match their gender. It is an umbrella term. So someone's gender identity or gender expression might not match what's culturally or typically associated with a gender or sex that they were assigned at birth. But transgender individuals, there's no one way, there's no right way to be trans. So some people will say identify as being transgender, some people will just say trans, some people might say that they are gender nonconforming, that they're non-binary, and then some people might use a combination of those different terms. And some people might one day identify as being transgender, and then the next day that doesn't fully feel right for them to say, or that's not the language that they would like to use. So then maybe you talk to them a week later and they say, I'm a gender nonconforming individual. Whatever someone tells you is what they prefer in terms of descriptive terms, just listen to them and then reflect back whatever they are using in that moment, during that time. Know that just because one day someone identifies as trans, the next day they're using gender nonconforming, that does not invalidate any of their experiences. That means that they are exploring gender, and gender's completely meant to be explored. It's not binary. That's why transgender is often used more as an umbrella term versus thinking that there's only cisgender, transgender, and there's nothing in between. Gender is meant to be explored. So it's not a dichotomy, but it's often presented that way in our society. So just know that, again, there's no right way to be transgender. Know that some people do seek to have medical surgeries if they're able to. Some people just prefer that the way that they present to the world looks more masculine or feminine. There's a lot of different ways that people can express being gender nonconforming, and all of them, whatever feels most authentic to somebody is completely right. It's whatever's going to make someone feel the best about themselves. That's what we should be supporting as a society. So gender expression or presentation, again, that is more of the external way that someone's presenting to the world. So gender identity, how you think about yourself internally. Gender expression, how others like view you. So how you present more to the world. So when you think about gender expression, what you're thinking about is different hairstyles, like even hair length, whether people wear makeup or not, nail polish or not. Often these things are considered more masculine or feminine. What kind of clothing somebody wears, that's absolutely gender expression. You've even seen some retail stores switch from having like a men's section and a women's section to just not labeling their sections, because people are going to choose to express their gender in whatever way they want. I remember like when I was taking my trans affirming therapy class, like we were given some different things to do to kind of just help us explore our gender as well, or explore what it felt like to maybe present in a way that doesn't match the biological sex you were assigned at birth. And I remember for one of the assignments, one of the things that I did, even I had always like shopped in the women's section because that's what had aligned with my biological sex assigned at birth. And I am a cisgender woman. But I really enjoy like a good masculine clothing. Like I do really enjoy that. But I just remember, you know, it had been so ingrained into me, like you shop in the women's section. And so one day I went to, I forget what store it was, but I went in the men's section and I bought some things for myself. And I remember just even in that experience kind of feeling like going into the men's section was like taboo or was stigmatized. And it made me really realize, you know, and I was like, why? Why do I feel this way? There's no reason for me to feel weird about wanting to wear different clothing. But the reason why is, of course, because gender expression is usually when we're growing up, you are like, girls wear dresses, girls wear skirts, girls do this. Boys wear more plain clothes, boys wear suits. And anyone should be able to wear anything and express themselves and express their gender in any way that feels the most comfortable to them. But we often do get messages, again, at such a young age of the acceptable ways for your gender to express themselves. And so a lot of times when someone's exploring being transgender or gender nonconforming, they are often exploring their gender expression as well and how that feels. And sometimes some people, you know, one day or 1 week want to present more masculine, other times they want to present more feminine. And all of that is completely okay and acceptable. And we should be giving people messages that it is completely acceptable. And the way that we do that, again, is media representation. The way that we do that is having public figures, celebrity figures, wearing different things to say that this is all okay. And the LGBTQ plus community has been at, you know, a leader and at the forefront of really showing how you can explore gender expression. And then sex, which this is referring to like biological sex, is the system for assignment and classification of people as male or female. It's often just based on your external genitalia. So it is definitely a very flawed system because biological sex really includes more than that. External genitalia is really just saying, okay, you're a male or female, and then that also leaves out a huge piece of acknowledging the intersex population. Sex characteristics, it includes external genitalia. It also includes chromosomes, sex hormones, and so secondary sex characteristics, that's usually what's happening more during puberty. And so you will see a lot of times for trans individuals when puberty hits, like maybe everything has been tolerable or has been manageable to kind of navigate until puberty hits. But then when puberty hits and you have increased estrogen levels or testosterone levels, or you start to have like breast development, your body starts to change. When that starts occurring, you can see for a lot of transgender individuals or gender nonconforming individuals that can be a really triggering time. That can definitely trigger a crisis scenario of, you know, I was okay until all of a sudden I started developing my breast, and now this is like too much. I need this to stop. And so there are like hormone replacement therapies and definitely accessible, but it's important to realize like secondary sex characteristics definitely have an impact on the trans community for sure. And then the the gender binary, I wanted to really include these definitions because biological sex and gender are both social constructs. When we think about even for biological sex, when we start to label external genitalia, so we start to say, okay, a penis is male and a vulva, vagina, that's female. Those are things that were constructed. I mean, that's not how language was developed. It's not just like we through evolution have always had these binary constructs. They have been created and embedded within our language, but it's not science. It's not a fact. It's just people deciding to label and language things the way that they decided to. And so it's important to realize that both of these systems, the biological sex binary and the gender binary, are very flawed, and that we should be really working to acknowledge anybody who does not fall within the binary. By really expanding our idea of what gender is and expanding our idea of what biological sex is, by doing that, we start to decrease rates of violence. And then I wanted to make sure that people are aware. So language, again, has changed over time. And so what you often hear now in terms of trans individuals is you'll hear someone identify as a trans woman or a trans man, and you can definitely drop the trans from this. So especially if someone presents and their gender expression is feminine, and someone sees them as a woman, but maybe they're a trans woman, if they're acknowledged as a woman, it's not like they're gonna be like, wait, I'm not a cis woman, I'm a trans woman. No, we have people present to our office because our VSP is housed with the LGBTQ plus program, and they'll just come in and say, you know, I'm a woman, and that is completely acceptable. We are not going to say, are you a trans woman or a cis woman? If someone just says, I'm a woman, I'm a woman. But it's important to realize like language has evolved over time. So in the past, instead of the terminology being trans woman, sometimes people would say, this is someone who was biologically assigned female at birth, but now they're a man. Or this is someone who is biologically assigned male at birth, but now they're a woman. And when people were using that language, sometimes it would be abbreviated as FTM, like female to male, or MTF, male to female. When those things are happening, it doesn't fully validate, like someone's just saying, I'm a woman, right? I'm a trans woman, I'm a woman. We don't need to acknowledge or go back to what they were assigned at birth. We need to be as affirming as possible and just say, this person's a woman. If that's how they present themselves, you just acknowledge that, use their pronouns, call it a day. If someone says I'm a trans woman, acknowledge that, use that terminology, call it a day. So just realize like the language has evolved over time to be more affirming. That being said, especially thinking about different generations, different people within this population are going to be preferred to be identified in different ways. And so it's just, again, really important to check in with someone, make sure that you're being as validating as possible by understanding what language they would like you to use in terms of addressing them. And then this is my last slide of definitions, I promise, but there's just so many important definitions. Transitioning. So transitioning is when someone is transitioning from being seen as one's birth assigned gender to one's actual gender. So transitioning can look so many different ways. It does not have to be, I think a lot of times when people think of the trans population historically, they think, oh, this person had genital surgery and like, that's it. And it's like, no, first of all, that's not done by everybody. It's not even accessible to everyone within this population. There's plenty of people who might absolutely want to do that, but cannot access it for, because of all the barriers in place. But oftentimes when someone is thinking about transitioning, what they might do is they might first start to explore their gender expression. And so, maybe a trans woman starts to wear dresses, starts to, maybe use different makeup, whatever that might look like for them. But they're just going to start to explore their gender expression. Someone might change their name, so then they start to use a new name, and then their old name becomes their dead name, a name that they don't no longer use. Maybe someone says, okay, I want to explore using she, her pronouns, or I want to explore using they, them pronouns. Someone might get a binder to, hold down or basically hold down their breast. Somebody might get, there's these contraptions which make it feel like you're peeing with a penis. I mean, there's just so many different ways that someone can explore what it might feel like to take a step further in exploring transitioning. But there's no right or wrong way to do this. So it's important to realize transitioning does not mean that someone's automatically going to have genital surgery. It doesn't mean that someone's going to have top surgery. It can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And for some people, when they start to explore, maybe wearing a binder, maybe that is enough. And for other people, that's not enough. And they think, okay, well, I need, like, my next step in this process is going to be having top surgery. So it's important to realize for everybody, it looks completely different. But the most important thing is to realize, like, when someone is exploring transitioning, you want them to be able to have access to whatever it is that they want that's going to make them feel aligned with their internal self. So it's going to be whatever feels the most authentic to that person that we want them to be able to access. Passing, this is language that's sometimes used. So passing, I've also heard people talk about like living in stealth. So when someone has transitioned sometimes or is exploring transitioning, and again, I say transition, that doesn't mean that they had to have surgery or anything. But if someone, is a trans woman and now when they present, people identify them as a woman, they might not, say, well, I'm a trans woman. They will just go, they're a woman, that's it. That is what you think of when you think of passing. That's like that idea. I know we talked earlier about the statistic, like only 4 out of every 10 people say that they know somebody who's trans. Well, that's where you can have people around you that are passing that you have no idea are trans, but they are, but they pass. And so you could definitely know trans individuals who you're just not aware of. So that is what passing is. And then sexual orientation, I just think it's really important to differentiate, especially considering the acronym, like the LGBTQ plus population. A lot of times people tie gender identity and sexual orientation together, but it's really important to realize like those are 2 different things. So sexual orientation is someone's romantic, emotional, or spiritual attraction to others. And trans people can be heterosexual, they can be gay, they can be lesbian, pansexual, queer. So that's just like anybody else. So it's important to realize that those 2 things are completely separate. Gender identity, sexual orientation are separate, but they are often talked about together. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. And then heteronormative, it refers to the deeply held institutional belief that relationships between heterosexual masculine cis men and heterosexual feminine cis women are normal, natural, or right. while all other relationships are viewed as abnormal, inferior, or wrong. And so we live in a society that is structured around this assumption. A lot of times in the media, the relationships that we are seeing are heterosexual, or the norm that we are living based off of and around is a heterosexual norm. And so when we see more gay and lesbian relationships portrayed in media, when we see relationships between trans individuals, those things are not the norm. And so we have to create more visibility so that we can say, yeah, all of this, there is no normal and abnormal. It's just what our society has deemed as normal and abnormal. And so to decrease violence towards the trans population, we have to be more inclusive, and we have to have more representation so that we can essentially break our heteronormative culture. And then transphobia, it's the fear or discomfort, distrust, or hatred directed towards trans people or trans concept. So transphobia can even just be not wanting to acknowledge that there's issues with the sex binary, there's issues with the gender binary. Transphobia can just be, I don't acknowledge this population, you're either a man or a woman. Transphobia comes up quite a bit, even when I do presentations. I will acknowledge that I'm speaking in the binary. A lot of times within my presentations, I only have enough time to really talk about like sexual violence against women, or I'm focused on gender-based violence, and I speak more in binary terms of women being victims and men being perpetrators. Obviously, sexual violence, it does not discriminate. And so all gender identities can experience sexual violence. But even sometimes when I say that, and I acknowledge that and take the time to say, I'm speaking in the binary, I acknowledge there's tons of different gender identities, I will get someone within the classroom that will say, wait. So you think that there's more genders than man and woman? Or you think that people, when they are born, are not just female and male? And I'll get people that ask those questions, and that in itself is a form of transphobia, of saying, no, there's only the binary. And so we, again, have to break that idea down. We have to break gender boxes. We have to break the idea of there only being two different biological sexes, and just expand people's ideas. And so in a nutshell, I really like this image, this graphic of this genderbread person, especially around the holidays, right? I mean, people are doing genderbread houses. So I saw this genderbread person, and I think it's just a good representation, because I know when you hear all these definitions, it can be really overwhelming. It can be a lot, but I think this is a great just image depicting kind of what I've been honing in on in terms of definitions. So gender identity, your internal views of yourself, gender expression, what the outside world is perceiving, if you are more feminine or masculine, attraction, your romantic, emotional, or spiritual feelings towards another individual, and your biological sex assigned at birth really just matches your external genitalia. Usually, even though it should be composed of like chromosomes, hormones, etc., sex characteristics, a lot of times people just see like penis, vagina, and they're like male, female, and that's it. So that's problematic, but that's really how it goes. And so all of these things are not the same. And so once we can be aware that these things are not the same, that these words are not interchangeable, we can really start to explore each area more. And I wanted to show this power and control wheel for specifically in lesbian, gay, transgender, and bisexual relationships, which was developed by the New York Anti-Violence Project. So when I'm giving presentations about nonviolent relationships and violent relationships, often I show a power and control wheel, but it is not this one. So it's important to realize that within LGBTQ plus relationships, there are different factors that happen within intimate partner relationships. And so there's more dynamics of power and control. So one partner can use transphobia or homophobia or biphobia as a way to abuse or control the other. So that could be, you know, I'm going to out you to your coworkers or your friends or your family. I'm going to, tell people that you don't want to know about your sexual orientation or about your the fact that you are a trans individual who's gender nonconforming. So you can have that happen. You can have someone within a relationship say, you know, if someone's trying to explore transitioning, you can have the other partner say or friend say, well, you can't transition because I'm worried about you. I'm worried that the world is going to abuse you, and I'm worried about the life that you're going to experience if you transition. And that in its own way, even if it's coming from a genuinely, I care about you, I want to protect you place, that in and of itself is abusive. To say, no, you can't operate like your more authentic self that you're telling me that you're ready to do because I'm scared of how the world is going to treat you. It's like, well, if you want to be more supportive, then you can start to work towards shifting the culture versus trying to change the person, right? It's the culture that's the problem, not the person. People can also use threats in relation to someone's STI status or HIV status. So people can threaten to say, I'm going to disclose to other people that you've tested positive for X or for so-and-so. And that is obviously just super abusive. And that does come up more so within the LGBTQ plus community. And then there's this sense of entitlement that also can factor within the LGBTQ plus community more specifically. So that can look different ways, even in terms of finances. If someone is trying to transition and they do decide that they want to have top surgery, or they decide that they want to have any kind of surgery, and that's going to cost money, the other person might say, well, no, we can't do that. We've saved this money for a down payment on a house, so no, you can't have your surgery because we need to be focused on this. So that can be withholding finances. That can also operate the other way around. So for trans individuals that are wanting to maybe go through a surgery or have a medical procedure, it's expensive. Any kind of surgery is expensive, right? I mean, that's just the reality. And so if someone wants to go through that, and then, you know, they're telling their partner, I know we saved this for a down payment on a house, but my transition, the surgery is the most important thing to me. Again, either way, either dynamic there can be an abuse of power. So in partnerships, especially intimate partner relationships, people should be making decisions together and supporting each other, and having equality within the relationship. And so if any of these things are coming up, that is absolutely not okay. Another big one that we see specifically that impacts the trans community is if they're in a dating relationship, then they might be with a partner and their partner says something that's a threat to them, like, well, if you leave me, nobody else is going to accept you, nobody else is going to love you. And there is a idea within the trans community, because it's a message given to them by society. When you're not seeing any representation of trans people within relationships, it can be easy for that idea to be planted in your head that trans people, people don't want to have relationships or romantic relationships with trans people. And obviously that is definitely incorrect. There's plenty of people who are in these relationships, but when that message is given to you by society, or you're given that message by someone who's so close to you that you love and you care about and you appreciate, that's going to make your self-esteem, your self-worth feel really low. And that can cause you to stay in a relationship being treated in a way that you definitely don't deserve to be treated. And it's really important to think about with the trans community, when we're looking at all these different forms of power and control and abuse within relationships, specifically with the trans community, we kind of highlighted how often the first forms of violence that trans individuals or gender expansive youth experience is often from their own homes, from their own family. A lot of times bullying starts at such a young age with this population. Even if it's not in the home, then maybe it happens at school. Maybe the school doesn't have a bathroom that isn't labeled man or woman. And so much happens to trans youth at such a young age that are forms of violence, whether it's, you know, at the severe end of the spectrum or microaggressions. And so it's really important to acknowledge, as the trans community gets older and is able to participate in these friendships, relationships outside of the home, you know, develop these romantic relationships, if all they've experienced and all that they have known is microaggressions and violence, hostile environments that don't accept them as who they are, it can be common for someone to think, well, this is just how it is. This is just how it is for the trans community. So whatever relationship I'm in, I just need to accept these forms of violence because it's all I've ever experienced. I don't know anything else. And so I'm just going to accept it. Again, because that's just how it is. And that's so terrible that happens, because everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, but it's just important to acknowledge that is what members of the trans community might experience or might go through. And I'm speaking in general terms. Obviously not all trans individuals go through this. There are tons of transgender individuals who experience and have great relationships, loving relationships, caring relationships. There are plenty of parents who create home environments that are loving, that let someone explore their gender identity, but there's just also plenty that don't. And so I kind of want to end this presentation more on an uplifting note, obviously, because when we're talking about rates of violence towards the trans community, it's pretty hard to hear and can be really a lot to take in. But there's plenty of things that you can do today to be a better ally. There's plenty of organizations and resources out there. Again, this is like a 101 presentation, so please know that if you're interested in learning more, there's just so many resources out there. Even there's a huge like YouTube, I mean, there's so many YouTube videos of different people talking about their experiences of being trans, and so tons to explore. But things that you can do, I did not realize I put that in a way that they all popped up individually. So one, talk about the trans community, talk about non-binary individuals and gender non-conforming individuals. Just acknowledging that this population exists is an example of a micro-inclusion. And a micro-inclusion is just a small step to include someone and acknowledge the humanity in each other. Something that you can do is also introduce yourself with your pronouns. So, and then invite other people to share their pronouns and really just normalize that. I know I have seen a shift in more and more people in terms of their workplaces start to include their pronouns in their signature lines. And that can be really helpful. It can be really intimidating for someone to say their pronouns if other people aren't. And so it's really good, even if you're leading an event, to say, okay, let's go around the room and introduce ourselves. I want you to say like your name, your pronouns, and one thing about you. And so just normalizing that and making it like the status quo can be really helpful. It's important to counter anti-trans comments of others. So obviously, if you hear someone saying something that is transphobic, it's really important to speak out, speak up, because you do not know if you're in the room with a trans individual. Be aware, just because you might not be aware that you are does not mean that you're not. And we can celebrate all bodies and all styles. So we can celebrate the fact that people are breaking gender norms. We can celebrate the fact that people are deciding how to express their gender in whatever way they are. And by celebrating anyone, regardless of what they're wearing, regardless of their hairstyle, regardless of what makeup, etc., when we just celebrate everyone being their most authentic selves, that can be really helpful in and of itself. I keep having Harry Styles come to mind, you know, being on the December Vogue cover this year and wearing a dress. And I keep thinking about the backlash that he experienced from some people of, okay, well, a man does not wear a dress. That is an example of transphobia, really. And we have to, again, celebrate people breaking these gender boxes. And then we can notice and comment on resilience that you see in other people. For the trans community, when the trans community takes another breath, when they live to see another day as their authentic selves, when they are living as their authentic selves, despite how much violence and microaggressions they can experience or even hate crimes, that is such an act of bravery and resilience. And I think it's so important that we acknowledge that and respect someone's bravery and resilience in being their most authentic selves. We can use social media to educate and support. So if any of y'all have your social media, definitely follow. The list of resources I put up at the end, they have Instagrams. They do a lot of great education through just their Instagram. So follow trans artists, activists, and authors on social media, see what they post, and then share that information. We can advocate to free bathrooms from the binary. I know that when I was in my trans affirming class, my professor asked us, he said, what bathroom would I go to in this building and how close is it? And, you know, we were all like thinking about it. And then he said he would not feel comfortable going to any bathrooms in the building because they are all binary. And so the closest, he had obviously found the closest bathroom that was gender neutral, didn't have an assigned sex on the door. And that was like at a subway that was like 2 miles down the street. So there's tons of trans youth that will have to like hold their bladders. It's a biological need to go to the restroom, right? And there's tons of trans youth who will literally just hold it all day because they don't have a bathroom that they can go to that's nearby. And that's horrifying that anyone would have to do that. It is a biological need. So it's really helpful when we have gender neutral bathrooms and we just say, hey, this is a biological need. So let's give everyone access and not make it a thing that people have to be choosing which bathroom to go into and be worried about experiencing a hate crime within the bathroom. And then we can use non-gendered language. So Texas is a great place to do this one because we always use y'all. I use y'all, you like, and it's just important to realize like a lot of times when we're starting presentations, like historically people will say like, hello, or like, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Well, when you say ladies and gentlemen, you're not including the trans population, you're not including gender nonconforming people. So it is really important to be aware of this. And instead of using gendered language, just say things like, y'all, good evening, y'all, whatever feels right for you, but we need to be taking out gender from language. So a lot of times people use pronouns she and he, and instead you can use the pronoun they as well. If you do not know somebody's gender identity, you can use they, theirs so that you're not assuming or gendering someone in a way that you really don't know if that's how they identify. And then you can learn how there are laws in place that can be used to help trans employees. You can learn, you know, what laws or what rights are available in your area for trans individuals by being familiar. If you know someone that is experiencing harassment, you can be that support for them and say, hey, there are protections for you, like let's get you assistance. And in terms of local resources, we obviously have our fabulous LGBTQ plus program. We have an Instagram. So definitely I encourage y'all to follow it. They share so much great information specific to the trans community and just the LGBTQ plus community in general. They also can assist with gender marker changes. They can assist with name and MAP ID updates. We've seen that as being one of like the top used resources within that program, which is really amazing that we can do that. There's emergency housing, especially with COVID. I know people have gone home to a place that they don't feel comfortable being their authentic selves, or if they are their authentic selves, they experience violence. If you are experiencing any family violence, any intimate partner violence, and you just don't feel like you have a safe place to go, know that we have access to emergency housing. Please reach out. And then LGBTQ plus wellness resources for sexual health as well, mental health resources, and if you have any need any assistance with academic concerns, we are here for you. And then even really close to campus, there is the Help Center, CAN Community Health. So there's lots of different resources. If you need help accessing them, please reach out and let us know because we are here for you. And then these are some additional resources that I found. I did pull a lot of information from Forge, which was a resource that I had on an earlier slide. Forge Forward, great, absolutely great resource. They have tons of great webinars that you can watch and explore more and get more education. And then I pulled a lot of the statistics I got today from the Human Rights Campaign's Violence Against the Transgender Community research and report. They do a report every single year. Unfortunately, 2020 has been one of the most violent years towards the trans community. We have already lost, and I say lost, I don't mean lost, 40 transgender individuals have already been fatally shot or violently murdered this year. I know that we're in December. We just recently had the Trans Day of Remembrance, November 20th. And at that time, I remember it was 37 people that we were acknowledging. So that's still even increased since then. And that was not that long ago, just a few weeks. And so it's really, really important to realize, again, the transgender community experienced some of the highest rates of violence. And in order to work towards ending that, we have to work towards shifting towards a nonviolent culture. We have to be speaking to this community. We have to be more inclusive as individuals. And again, you know, wherever you are in your journey and learning more about this community, whether you are an ally to it or involved in it, just know that we're here for you. We're here to support you. If there's anything that we can ever do to be more supportive, please let us know. And that is that. This is my contact information. If you have any questions, if you have any feedback, comments, concerns, whatever it might be, feels, please don't hesitate to reach out. Again, I'm here and I'm always taking ideas for different presentations moving forward. And then we will continue our series next week. And if y'all have any questions, just let me know. I'm here for you. So thank you so much for journeying. You did journey with me today if you watched this presentation, but thank you just for joining this presentation today. I really appreciate it. And yeah, appreciate y'all. So y'all have a great afternoon and good luck with finals and wrapping up the semester. And just know that we are here and gonna continue to be here to support you. So y'all have a good one. Thank you.